Hi, Life Groups. Welcome to your gathering wherever you are meeting during the day or in the evening. We're going to jump right in as we look at Philippians 2 in our series called Rejoice. Rejoice in humility. Philippians 2, 1-11 has to be one of the most beautiful expositions of and theologies, really, of who Jesus is, his downward journey to the cross, and really at the end, his glorification as well. So we think about humility. John Dixon, who is a believer in Jesus, works at Marquette University. It's not a religious institution, but his department explored the origins of humility as a social virtue. What they found was that leading up to the first century, there was something called philotomia, which really was the pursuit of honor. That's how the world operated. Public shame was feared. They looked at a 6th century BC kind of ethical document called the Delphic Canon. And it was considered the sum and substance of ethical life. And in there was lots of ethical acts, a lot of here's what you do, here's how you act, but nothing of humility was mentioned. So they looked at history and thought, well, where does the world understand humility as a social virtue? What they found was that there was a humility revolution that took place in the middle of the 1st century. And what his department found was that the cross of Jesus Christ turned the world's view of what it means to be humble and actually as a pursuit or something that's a good thing, because before this time it wasn't. And obviously this is found in the person and work of Jesus. And so my ideas are this: humility is instructed, humility is displayed, and humility is experienced. The first 4 verses of Philippians 2 are these imperatives, which means instructions to this ancient community about humility, about consider others better than yourself. And so the first few verses is Paul's appeal to their experience. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. So what he's basically doing is he's replaying their spiritual journey. And he's saying, if Christianity, if Jesus has done anything for you, he's reminding them about their experience. Then if that's true, then what you need to do is this: make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being in one spirit and of one mind. So if Christianity's done anything, if you've experienced Jesus, community, compassion, love, divine mercy, then here's what you need to do: is you need to be of one mind. And then in verse 3, he gets very specific and he appeals to humility. And he says this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Let me unpack those words. Selfish ambition is this idea. It's actually in its original form of the word. It's this idea of a greedy grasp for public office through unjust means. And so there's this view of a politician who's lying and stealing and doing everything wrong to get power. That is what selfish ambition means. In our cultures, ambition is celebrated. It's the way that we accomplish things. And with proper motives, there's nothing wrong with ambition. But selfish ambition is toxic to gospel community. Then he also says vain conceit. Vain glory or an empty boast. That's what it means. It's prideful boasting. The idea here is that life's a stage and you are the main actor. It's all about you. Lights, camera, action. It's all about you. And so we see this idea of vain conceit all over our world and in our culture. For me, when I think of vain conceit, I think of the person who pulls up to the light in the summer with their windows down and their music pumping, their bass is going, and it's this idea of, hey, everybody, look at me. I am worthy of your attention and your praise. Vain conceit, it's all this idea that we're entitled to people's attention. So he says, don't do that. He says, rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Humility is a lowliness of heart, and it's the antidote to vain conceit and selfish ambition. There's a story of a conductor of a symphony. They were asked, what's the hardest instrument to play in the symphony? He said, second fiddle. And I quote, I can find plenty of first violinists, but to find someone who can play second violin with enthusiasm, that is a problem. And he says, if we have no second violin, we have no harmony. This is the idea of humility is instructed. And then he goes into the imperative, or the indicative. So the imperative is the instruction. The indicative is the story of Jesus, the reason for why we should be humble. And he goes through his downward humiliation and then his glorification. So in verse 6, we see, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. The first here is in verse 6. It's humility in heaven. This is Jesus in his pre-incarnate state, thinking of what does it mean to be God? So the Son of God was contemplating what it means to be equal to his Father, and he comes to a conclusion that no one except for the Father expects. And he concludes that equality with God is not something to take advantage of, rather a means towards emptying oneself and taking the form of a servant. So he didn't renounce his divinity. Rather, in becoming human and becoming a servant, he was expressing all of what that divinity means. And so what does it mean to be God? Jesus is thinking about this. What it means to be God, listen, is that he would empty himself and make himself nothing. This is absolutely altering, shifting for us about when we think about who God is. Jesus is showing what does it mean to be God. It's actually not to be used to his own advantage, rather to empty himself for our benefit. Then verse 7, humility in his incarnation. It says, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. He emptied himself. So what that means is that all of the advantages given to him were emptied so he could take the form of a slave. It is not that he emptied himself of his divine nature, but he metaphorically emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. It was voluntary in doing this. He manifested the form of God in the form of a slave. And then in verse 8, it's humility in his death. So humility in heaven, humility in the incarnation in verse 7, and humility is in his death in verse 8. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This is absolutely crazy. That what does it mean to be God? It means that he empties himself and finds himself on a Roman cross. So polite Roman society considered the mention of the cross to be an obscenity, and yet this is where God finds himself. And so the whole trajectory of these verses of 6, 7, 8 is downward. It could be summed up like this. Glory was his from all eternity. He gave it up. He became human. He became a slave. He was obedient. He was nothing. He died like a slave. He died on a cross, all the way down from heaven with his crown to the cross. So this radically changes how we view Jesus. See, Christ did not die a shameful death to only grant your attention. He died this death so he could purchase your salvation. Christ did not die a noble death for the godly, but a scandalous death for the ungodly. And the question is, how can anyone be arrogant standing next to the cross, where this is where God finds himself? And finally, my third thought is humility experience in verses 9 to 11. Therefore, because of his obedience, because of his death, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. What's happened in verse 6, 7, and 8 is a ratcheting down, and in verses 9 to 11, it's the explosion of now his glorification. Because of his humiliation, now the Father glorifies him. So verses 9 and 11 is really, what does the Father think of Jesus' incarnation and death? It's that God exalts him now. He is glorified. So the story does not end in a shameful cross, but with the power of Jesus exalted and resurrected, that praise be to God, Jesus is no longer a slave, but he is now glorified, and he is who he is. Jesus Christ is Lord is the earliest explanation of the gospel. It's a confession of the gospel. And so what Paul is saying here is everyone, either willingly or begrudgingly, will proclaim the true identity of Jesus, that everybody will humble themselves in front of this Jesus because of what he has done on the cross. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, nobody stands at the Grand Canyon and thinks, whoa, I am awesome. Why? because you're standing next to something great. What should our posture be standing next to the glorified Jesus? Not that I'm awesome, but humility. Jesus is awesome. And so what's your response? Few things. Maybe you need to say sorry to somebody. This is in relationships, because in verse 5 it says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset. So this is about community. This is what Paul is reminding us. So who do you need to say sorry to? This is about us and humility. Secondly, how do you view God? Jesus shows us what God is like. He's not out to get you. He's actually here to serve you, and he has done so on the cross. And are you fully devoted to Jesus? That's the meaning of this text, is to humble ourselves in front of King Jesus. He is good. He does good. And we rejoice in humility. Bless you now as you talk, discuss, and pray. Thanks.